So it's worth stepping back and thinking about what is infrastructure. So it's really the physical backbone that our societies need to function. So you think of transport, roads, ports, airports, you think of energy and utilities, all of the complex to transport, store, distribute energy. You think of digital infrastructure, from mobile phone towers all the way to data centers, and then social infrastructure. And I think we see a confluence of factors today that is quite extraordinary, whereby there's an energy crisis, there's a climate crisis where we are in a rush to reach net zero. We have an energy security crisis, whereby with the war in Ukraine, we have to be more independent when it comes to sourcing our energy. And then you have the digital revolution of data centers, artificial intelligence, and that requires a lot of energy. So just on the energy side of things, there's such a need for energy and for clean energy. You look at transport, there is a massive need of capital just to upgrade and maintain the existing legacy infrastructure. Just looking at that, digital, transport, and energy, massive opportunity to deploy capital.
I want to share with our viewers some of the numbers that you shared also with us ahead of the interview. You're saying the infrastructure asset class has grown from about 1.2 trillion, and you're expecting it to reach $1.7 trillion by 2028. Could you just give us a little bit more detail on why is this going up? And ultimately, can governments, or is this more private money, actually step in when we look at the high levels of public debt at this stage?
It's a relatively young asset class, infrastructure. It was born out of the privatizations back in the 1980s of state-owned assets, telecommunication, transport, energy. And it's been a slow growth starting in the late 80s. We have started investing 20 years ago in infrastructure. Private funds per AUMs were around $50 billion at the time. You mentioned 1.2 trillion today, and the forecast is for it to get to close to 2 trillion by the end of this decade. I think, one, on the supply of capital, the asset class is better understood, it's become legitimate alongside private equity and real estate and other alternatives. And then on the demand side, it's what I mentioned, the massive need for capital that there is to be invested. And the one thing I'd say, which is really important, is if you think of the amounts that are required to fund, tomorrow's infrastructure, they dwarf everything that has been spent to build yesterday's infrastructure. So I think the growth trajectory is not stopping. And the last point to your question, governments with their deficits, with their budgets under pressure, do not have the means to fund that infrastructure. And so it has to be a public-private partnership between private investors and the public sector.
I also want to get your thoughts on what could be the impact of politics on this part of the market, because recently we have seen a bit of a change in rhetoric from some politicians, particularly in Europe, about, perhaps we can't be as strict and as ambitious when it comes to the carbon, becoming carbon neutral and so on. The momentum we had seen in the past towards the green transition has boosted some investments. But are you concerned that as politicians change their rhetoric a little bit, that perhaps this momentum will actually dissipate?
Yes, so we've always been very focused on the fact that it is an asset class that is in the spotlight by definition, because it's touching the full population of every country. And so the political risk, the reputational risk is important. Where we focus is on places where you do not depend on subsidies, you do not depend on government help. So you're looking, in the way we approach our mandates, we're looking for places where the unit economics, as we like to think about it, the returns you can achieve on the capital that you deploy on a unit of capex doesn't depend on subsidies. And so, because I think, if you go back for the last 20 years, you have seen, times when investors have been heard by government policies and changes in government policies. So you need to make sure that by the time you spend capital, it is de-risked and you have contract, and we prefer private contracts as much as possible.